The power and independence of the Federal Reserve. The last video, 33 minutes, 10 seconds, I said great accolades when I meant to insert the word great accidents. Now, Volcker was not the Carter administration's first candidate, but he was the Wall Street favorite. As journalist William Grieder wrote, Volcker's resume looked as if he had been training for his job for almost 30 years. Not everyone agreed, especially within the Carter-Glass administration. Many regarded him as too rigidly conservative and not enough of the team player. But his support among the members of the financial markets made him a leading candidate, and Carter interviewed him for the post. Volcker recalls in contemporaneous reports confirmed the Volcker did most of the talking, and pledged emphatically that he would be an independent central banker, would focus on the using of the Fed's authority to tackle inflation. Volcker thought his Oval Office performance disqualified him from the post, but Carter thought otherwise. Ignoring advice, the president's selection of Volcker would effectively mortgage his recollection of the Federal Reserve. Volcker was appointed to the post. The Dow Jones stock average rose as the news of the price of gold fell. Carter had apparently reassured his financial markets. At the same time, the fiscal fight against inflation was entering at least in its 10th year. But the political momentum behind it was much older. We already saw how much Eisenhower paid attention to inflation, including his first State of the Union address. Richard Nixon had campaigned in 1968 on a promise of the price stability and in an effort to control inflation by executive fiat currency, sometimes usually follows that word, fiat currency, had instituted a 60-day price freeze in 1973. Soon after taking office, General Ford had promised to make inflation America's public enemy number one, and had started distributing Whip Inflation Now buttons to members and the public to encourage them to do everything they could, whatever that was, to control it. Carter continued the tradition of invoking inflation specters as part of the reason of the American people felt so dissatisfied with their government, economy, even society. Taming the Dragon, the battle against inflation. Volcker's successful effort to stop inflation stemmed from an approach to monetary policy that had until then not been tried. Rather than aiming its monetary policy at interest rate targets as the Fed had done historically, Volcker began cautiously, almost reluctantly, to target the amount of money in the system and letting the interest rates sort themselves out. Explaining the difference in approaches could get technical quickly, but the gist of the difference is that the interest rate approach doesn't look too much at how much money is flowing through the system. It wants to keep interest rates relatively stable and then move them one direction or another. In the interest rate climate at the time, however, the benchmark interest rate was already almost 11%, and tweaking interest rates in the traditional way meant playing a constant game of catch-up with the financial markets and individuals, households, labor unions, and companies making decisions in the anticipation of what the dollar would be worth. Some then played this game catch-up using intuition, some using econometrics, and some with the pure panic, measuring money. By taking the modern flexible monetary policy approach to raising nominal interest rates, the numbers actually quoted in the newspaper in an environment where the inflation rate was galloping away. The Fed's central bankers were doing nothing to combat inflation and doing a great deal to help it. The result was an inflationary period the economists and historians have called the Great Inflation. The alternative favored by some influential economists was to engage in monetary targeting. With monetary targeting, the central bank lets its interest rates float according to the quantity of money in the system. Crudely measured, central banking facing inflation could dramatically restrict the amount of money circulating in the economy, thereby allowing interest rates, the price the banks and soon everyone must pay to get money, to float where they would, as a market-based reaction to the central bank's decisions. This scarcity of money would have dire consequences to the health of the economy. Millions would lose work as consumers stopped financing purchases, businesses closed, and the economy entered recession, but inflation would stop. This is what economist Milton Friedman meant by his famous dictum, inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. Yes, his famous dictum. Inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. A central bank caught in an inflationary spiral has an easy exit. According to Friedman and his fellow monetarists, starve the economy of money and inflation will cease. Volcker himself took some convincing to make this regime change. He was opposed to the monetary targets while on the FOMC as president of the New York Fed and expressed misgivings later. But under his leadership, monetarism became the official policy of the FOMC. Interest rates climbed above 22% in 1981. That came permanently below 10% only in 1984. Shout out to George Orwell writing the book 1984. Just throwing that out there. Still gonna read that. Hopefully I'll get that on video. Causing a recession, but ultimately slaying the inflation dragon. Doing so left a lasting legacy. The Volcker FOMC strategy, and it was the strategy of the entire FOMC under Volcker's leadership, was dramatic, untested, damaging to the economy and ultimately successful. Over the course of several years and millions of jobs lost and skyrocketing interest rates, inflation came down to a manageable level, something the previous three Fed chairs could not accomplish, and with that success, costly though it was, came the conclusion that reinforced the vision of the Fed as a chaperone. Despite constantly channeling anti-inflation rhetoric, the political branches were not up to the task of managing the value of the nation's currency. It not only took a central banker to perform the task, other central banks other central bankers, of course, knew about monetarism and its potential for combating inflation. It took Paul Volcker and his associates on the FOMC. Arguably, Volcker gets more credit than he deserves for this remarkable period in Fed history, for two reasons. First, as everywhere, the Fed was a deliberative body. The FOMC transcripts from this period show extraordinary deliberation, skepticism, and polarized views. Volcker was an able guide to these discussions, but his views were pushed and pulled from various directions. The decisions were made through committee, built on compromise, and second, Ronald Reagan and his economic team also deserve credit for not using political tactics to subvert the Volcker FOMC. The short-term economic consequences of these actions were devastating. Volcker was not Reagan's man, and his team wanted him removed from his post, but even before Reagan was inaugurated in 1981, and yet the administration gave the Fed's policy makers a free hand. This praise must be tempered by the fact that inflation was overwhelming electoral concerns and the public generally supportive of Volcker's efforts, but the pain caused to be the unemployed was very real, and no politician likes facing an election in a recession. And true expectations of the 1982 midterm election was a Republican drubbing in the House. Upon Volcker's registration in 1987, well after his successes were clear, the peons to his greatest came pouring in. General Ford, whose Whip Inflation Now program had ended without success, praised him for handling domestic and international pressures and challenges with superb skill and unquestioned integrity. Margaret Thatcher, who sought to follow a similar course acting as her own independent central bank, wrote that she very much admired Volcker's resolute pursuit of second monetary policies and the great skill and understanding you have brought to the complex task of reducing inflation in the world's largest economy. Even those affected by his policies wrote to extend their thanks. One man upon Fredonia, Pennsylvania wrote, "Though I was employed for an extended period, I always understood and agreed with your policy as Chief of the Federal Reserve. You saved my life savings from becoming worthless, while a lesser person might have caved in political pressure. You, sir, served our nation and all its people with distinction." Volcker and too big to fail banking. There is another side, however, to the Volcker legacy, this time more from the Board of Governors than the FOMC. The 2008 financial crisis brought the term too big to fail into public discussion in a profound and public way. There's even an HBO film by that name, based on the best-selling journalist account with the same title by New York Times journalist Andrew Ross Sorkin. But there was nothing new about government-sponsored bailouts of large financial institutions. We've seen them throughout history in this country and in others. Volcker, however, brought the doctrine into modern practice and provided the antecedent for its continued shelf life. In 1982, in partial consequence of Volcker's FOMC-owned interest rate policies, but also owning to risk management failures within financial institutions, the Fed became concerned about the level of risk in the financial system. "If it gets bad enough," quotes, he reported to the FOMC, "we can't stay on the side or we'd have a major liquidity crisis. It's a matter of judgment. Liquidity crisis. It's a matter of judgment as to when and how strongly to react. We are not here to see the economy destroyed in the interests of not bailing somebody out." The FOMC followed his lead, and in 1984, shout out to George Orwell, and the largest bank loaned to a single institution until that time. The Volcker Board of Governors, through the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, extended an unprecedented $3.6 billion loan to Continental Illinois. It wasn't enough. The bank failed anyway. But with the failure, the modern doctrine of too big to fail banks was born. The Volcker Fed was the midwife. Volcker's contributions to the institutional development of the Fed are complicated. From a regulatory perspective, while he was more in favor of aggressive regulatory responses than some of his Reagan-era colleagues, the Volcker Fed adopted a posture to financial stability that would serve as a model for good or ill. In the later crisis, from a monetary perspective, the priority of the price stability over employment has caused some to wonder whether inflation might have been tamed with less costly measures. Even so, there is no dispute that Volcker's lasting contribution to the practice of central banking is in the personification of the modern central banker. After Volcker, people saw the Fed chair must be the chaperone to the populist Ulysses. Central bank independence in the mechanism that allowed Volcker to carry the day. The thinking now goes, even though the costs of the economy are exactly the kind of thing that democracies punish their politicians, including, as it had happened, Jimmy Carter for creating. Greenspan the Oracle. If Paul Volcker was the embodiment of central bank as inflation's master, Alan Greenspan came to be the icon of the central bank as the all-powerful deity of the economy. Greenspan came to the Fed as Volcker's preferred successor. Very soon, Greenspan began putting his mark on the Fed by governing monetary policy under the Greenspan standard. a style of central banking that meant two economists equipped whatever Alan Greenspan thinks it should be. This extraordinary authority came because it seemed to work, and because it worked, Greenspan received adulatory attention from the public. Though it can be difficult to see it through the fog, the financial crisis of 2008, the image of the Federal Reserve during the Greenspan era was unlike anything in Fed history. Short of the iconic presidents, few, if any, figures in the U.S. history enjoyed the heights and fame and prestige that Greenspan enjoyed during his tenure. Consider two illustrations of this prestige: the journalistic scandal of Stephen Glass and the public discussion surrounding President Clinton's impeachment. One of the most notorious instances of sustained journalistic fraud occurred in the mid-1990s at the hands of policy wunderkind Stephen Glass. Glass was just 23 years old, a recent graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. When he first started writing for the New Republic, then billed as the in-flight magazine for Air Force One, Glass wrote piece after piece depicting sensational plot lines, a convention that sold ribald, Monica Lewinsky-themed paraphernalia, a cult devoted to the worship of George H.W. Bush, the First Church of George Herbert Walker Christ, and the one that led to his downfall. The story of a 15-year-old hacker who so impressed a large tech company with his defacement of the company's website that it sought to hire him as an absurd salary and a lifetime subscription to Playboy magazine. Among the fabrications was an article about the cult of personability that surrounded Fed Chair Alan Greenspan. Praise be Greenspan. Outlined investment traders, Washington power brokers, and even everyday Americans who vertically worshiped the man. One arbitrager kept a chair in which Greenspan had sat in for the 1940s, secured by blue velvet ropes. Some nights when we've lost money, the trader said, I come in here and sit in the chair and think. It gives me inspiration. One Washingtonian attending a large dinner party tried to scuffle seat assignments during cocktails, even at the expense of leaving his wife sitting with strangers. When confronted, he quipped, I could have dinner with my wife any night of the week. In the course of human history, having dinner with Greenspan might be as important as the Last Supper. Many of all these quotes and quips were inventions of creative fabulists, but they worked so well because they were so believable. The defecation of the chair of the Federal Reserve System was, in the roaring 1990s, something of an undisputed fact. Glass could sell magazines with phony stories because his readers would nod their heads in amused agreement with what they took as an undisputed fact. Alan Greenspan really was that big of a deal. The second illustration comes from Jennifer Flowers, Arkansas lounge singer, an extramarital love interest of then Arkansas's Governor Bill Clinton. In an interview on Larry King Live on the topic of Lewinsky scandal, Flowers explained why people should have the resignation of the embattled president. Quote, I think most people are concerned that if Bill Clinton were to resign tomorrow, that the bottom would drop out and we would all be devastated. But my research tells me that if he did resign tomorrow, we may have a little bit of a problem for a couple of days, but I would assure that Alan Greenspan them would give in there and make sure that our economy would become healthy right away. End quote. It may seem trivial to quote two people from 1990s history who many would like to forget, but the point is so profound, one even in the midst of potential constitutional crisis, the hope expressed on national television by a non-expert reassured us all that the Greenspan wouldn't let the economy collapse. Greenspan became a capitalistic hero and a political icon. Even Bob Woodward, the journalist famous for skepticism of high power in places, wrote a glowing short biography of Greenspan. By the book's title and contents, Greenspan was the maestro in our democratic society. He was maestro. I don't know how they spelt that. Pronounce it as you will. He was the brilliant, omnipotent economic oracle. Greenspan was the Fed, and the Fed was extraordinary, almost limitless power to keep the economic engine running. This popular faith in Greenspan, faith often missing in the rest of the government, shows profound influence on the mystique of an independent central bank. The Fed in Greenspan years became, even in the public consciousness, an institution, almost divorced from government. The view depended on the idea that the Fed had the ultimate authority over the economy and could guarantee stability, prosperity, and low inflation. Greenspan's secret discretion, flexibility, and the Greenspan put. How did Greenspan achieve this extraordinary reputation? The short answer is, again, the record of low inflation and steady growth that coincided with his tenure. But this more comprehensive answer and the key to the rise in power of the Federal Reserve generally is two factors. First, maximal flexibility and discretion for Fed policy, and second, the reassurance to the financial markets that the Fed will provide whatever liquidity necessary to maintain stable market conditions. The second factor is sometimes called the Greenspan put. The idea that the Fed should retain maximal flexibility was not Greenspan's, of course, in this continuation of the Martin Rifler approach, but it came at a time when economists began a systematic challenge to the desirability of discretionary central banking policy as a good way to recognize economic policy. In a 1977 article, this eventually contributed to its authors. Nobel Prize in economics economists argued that economic policy makers, including principally central bankers who have complete discretion to determine future policy, are going to do it badly. More specifically, according to this argument, a central banker sensitive to his appointment by politicians will have the same pro-inflationary bias as their political metaphors. A politician's appointee wants to stay on the politician's good side. No better way to do it than by assisting in inflationary support just in time for an election. The better approach, the authors argue, is to create a rule through law that establishes the central bank's credible commitment against inflation well ahead of the time and limits the central banker from deviating from the rule, in that sense that the Fed ties itself to mast. 2. This approach to Fed independence, of course, forms the backbone of the standard account this book criticizes. What is fascinating about the Ulysses Punchbowl view of the central bank independence of the Greenspan era is much the central banking in practice varied from that theoretical model. As two economists assessing the Greenspan Fed near the end of Greenspan's tenure put it, the Fed brought inflation drawn dramatically under Paul Volcker and has controlled both inflation and real fluctuations well under Greenspan in the process. It has built up an enormous reservoir of trust and credibility, and it has accomplished all this without rules or even any serious pre-commitments. Even in his very words, Greenspan sought to retain full tactical control over the levers of central bank authority. As he famously said shortly after his appointment as Fed chair, "Since I became a central banker, I've learned to mumble with great incoherence. If I seem unduly clear to you, you must have misunderstood what I said." Greenspan gathered power to himself and to the Fed through maintaining freedom of movement. That freedom became one of his most important legacies. Policy discretion by itself isn't enough to spin central bankers to Pantheon, it depends on what the policymaker does with that discretion that matters. With Greenspan, an important use of his discretion was the perception and fact that he was committed to giving financial markets a soft landing amid national and international turmoil. The idea here is that the Fed, embodied by Greenspan, would always be there to put the bottom to the market and to keep the bottom within investors' reach. Thus is the infamous Greenspan put, a name that comes from the world of options trading. A put option is a contract that allows its holder to sell an asset like a stock or to someone else at a specific price. It's kind of an insurance, a guarantee that no matter how far the asset falls, the holder of the put option will always be able to recover at least something. Alan Greenspan's leadership at the Fed during times of severe market disruption gave market participants the sense that they will always be able to land with their feet on the ground. As a report in the Financial Times put it in 2000, when financial markets unravel, count on the Federal Reserve and its chairman Alan Greenspan eventually to come to the rescue. The perception widely shared among market participants was built on repeated assurances from the Greenspan Fed. This occurred when the stock market experienced the largest sell-off since the Great Depression. In October 1987, during the Mexican peso crisis in 1995, when markets grew skittish at the risk of default on the peso, during the East African financial crisis of 97 through 98, when attention shifted to currency crisis on the other side of the globe, at the failure of the hedge fund long-term capital management in response to implosion of equity markets after the dot-com crash in March 2000, and finally in response to the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon on 2001, September 11th, the precise policy response in each instance was different. And the idea of Greenspan was self-consciously bailing out market participants from bad decisions in due course of conclusion. But there was no question that Greenspan's Fed's monetary policy philosophy was consistent with this view, because the Greenspan put worked because the economic boom continued without triggering inflation. It is not difficult to see why it was easy to believe that cults of Wall Street traders worship the central banker, Greenspan the regulator. The view of Greenspan as economic royalty, perhaps an economic deity, is not the only aspect of his legacy. In fact, in light of the financial crisis of 2008, it may not be the only one remembered by the future generations. Instead, Greenspan's legacy as a regulator will continue to color the way he is remembered. It also demonstrates important aspects of the Fed's power and independence. Greenspan was an obvious choice for Ronald Reagan from a monetary policy perspective, but he was a curious choice as a government regulator. The problem was that he came from an intellectual tradition that didn't believe in the legitimacy or efficiency of government regulation or private markets. In the 1950s, he became part of the ironically named Collective, a group devoted to the person and teachings of libertarian novelist Ayn Rand. The irony was intentional. Collective behavior was the polar opposite of their individualistic worldview. Greenspan was an active part of the Collective, writing its newsletter, attending its parties, engaging in its debates. Rand was, in his words, a stabilizing force in his life. His devotion to her was extraordinary. He subjected first dates to essays he had written for her, and even credits her as having the vision to predict almost alone the internal collapse of the Soviet Union. Greenspan allows that Rand shares the distinction with Ronald Reagan. It did not go without notice, he writes, that Ayn Rand stood beside me as I took the oath of office as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the presence of the President. Ford in the Oval Office. Even as Greenspan rose in government, first as an advisor to the president and next as one of the following officials in the late 20th century, he maintained his Randian suspicion of governmental intervention in private life, especially private economic life, under a Randian view of the world that Greenspan seemed to endorse, at least early in his life. Even taxation was immoral. If people valued essential government services like courts and national defense, they would volunteer to pay for them. In his memoir, Greenspan notes the irony of his government service and accepted it as a cost to fulfilling his public ambitions. By the time I joined Richard Nixon's campaign for the presidency in 1968, I had long since decided to engage in efforts to advance the free market, capitalism as an insider, rather than a critical pamphleteer. After he assured the Fed chair, it didn't take long for Greenspan's ideological hostility to regulation to make itself manifest. He made this clear himself. Since I was an outliner in my libertarianism, opposition to most regulation, I plan to be largely passive in such matters and allow other Federal Reserve governors to take their lead. But largely passive isn't exactly correct, nor was he such an outlier. Greenspan was a leader in a movement that asserted an intellectual basis for a conservative libertarian worldview. Their influence in the Reagan administration was profound, and nowhere more powerful than in exactly the kinds of economic policies that Greenspan espoused. True to form, Greenspan actively sought to shape the Fed's regulatory agenda by limiting its overall commitment to several areas of banking regulation. As the consumer banking scholars Kathleen Engel and Patricia McCoy note, nowhere was this more evident than in mortgage lending. Mortgage lending in 2015, we know it as a potential source of catastrophic financial instability. We started in 2006 through 7, as the subprime mortgage crisis became the full-blown global financial crisis by 2008. While shelves groaned under the weight of the books that diagnose the crisis and its origins, a common theme is that too many people borrowed too much money with too little ability to repay it. When housing prices stopped their vertiginous ascent to swiftly collapse across the country, it became obvious that the extent of the default on these mortgages far exceeded almost everyone's expectations, and the resulting sell-offs of the uncertainty as to who held the remaining debt created the financial crisis. There are disputes about who is responsible for this chain of events: greedy banks, irresponsible homeowners, venal politicians, all of the above. The basic connection between mortgage lending and financial instability, however, is clear. Among the parties not listed above is one of the most important following the crisis. The question was frequently asked,